One of the biggest trends on lifting TikTok right now is high intensity, extremely low volume training as popularized by Mike Mentzer and Dorian Yates. And I just want to give my honest thoughts on this style of training. Over the last number of years, I've probably leaned a little bit closer to this style of training, more so than I did in my earlier years. In my earlier years, yes, I had beginner gains to contend with, but I also saw quite a bit of growing in my first 1 to 5 years. I did probably 75-80% of the growing that I've done so far, or in altogether, in my first 5 years in the gym. Now, beginner gains was part of that. Potentially the modality of training that I pursued was another big influencer of that. I definitely lean towards the higher volume end of the spectrum. This never really came at the cost of intensity. Intensity was something that always permeated through each training session that I did. I always had, from the moment I walked into the gym, I looked at the big bodybuilders, I looked at the size of them, number one, but I looked at how they train, number two, and almost always they seem to be out of breath, they seem to be sweating, and they seem to be pushing themselves, even if they were geared up, to the point where they physically could not complete another repetition, and in some cases even pushed past that by virtue of doing partial repetition. So I've always had an inclination to work at a very high intensity, but I couple that in my first, I suppose, 1 to 6 years of training with a comparatively high amount of volume. So I used to even do 16 sets for quads or for chest or for back in one workout, and looking back, it was definitely too much, but it also correlated with the time in which I did the most growing. So while that is extreme on one end of the spectrum in terms of the amount of volume that one should be doing in a session, I think it's indicative of something that's required, or something that I feel and definitely stand by as being one of the important aspects of building a great physique, building a great amount of muscle. Popularized now is the extreme on the opposite end of that spectrum, and that is the extreme of doing extremely low volume. So I think 2 sets per exercise completely to failure, and maybe training 3, max 4 days a week. And my honest thoughts on this is that you always have to take with a pinch of salt the advice of bodybuilders, whether old school or not, whether extremely intelligent or not. You have to take with a pinch of salt bodybuilders who are or have been roided up to their eyelids. Mike Mentzer did a lot of questionable things. A smart man nonetheless. Haven't looked into his modalities and his methods too much, but from what I understand, he was a very smart man. But he also took meth as pre-workout. So a lot of questionable shit. I don't see too many people, or I at least hope too many people aren't taking meth and amphetamines as a pre-workout, because I think that would be a little bit unnecessary. But he also, as a classic bodybuilder who gave Arnold a run for his money, was probably most likely up to his eyelids in steroids. Now, I'm the first one to say that just because someone takes steroids does not completely disregard what they say. I still do think following a lot of Arnold's advice, following a lot of Mike Mentzer's advice is going to put you more or less on the right track. They may get away with things that natural lifters, and I speak exclusively to natural lifters. There may be some people who take gear who follow me, that's absolutely fine, but my audience are people like me who have never taken a steroid, who don't foresee that they'll be taking steroids, and what they can do to maximize their potential in the gym. I do like high intensity. I'm not overly against low volume, but what I will say for someone who wants to build the best possible physique is I think most people lack the capacity to work at a high enough intensity for 3 days of the week, for 2 sets per exercise, for maybe 2 or 3 exercises per session, to really extract the most amount of stimulus from those sets, to grow equivalent to someone who does, let's say, double the amount of volume. And this is my overall take on the Mike Mentzer argument.
High-intensity training has been recognized as the ultimate method for increasing muscular size and strength.
You know, what do I think of the high-intensity, extremely low-volume style training versus the high-volume, slightly more moderate intensity? I lie somewhere in the middle, as I do on most things. I think high-intensity is a modality of training that needs to be, if you really want to grow to the size that I have, or achieve your natural potential, you need to be working at a high capacity, you need to be training at a high intensity. That is unavoidable.
For optimal results, the single most important factor is intensity of effort.
So we'll take that, but we'll blend that with a slightly more moderate approach to volume. We're not going extremely high as maybe I did in my first 1 or 2 years of lifting, where I was doing 16 to sometimes 20 sets for a muscle group in a session. That's way too much. But maybe can we fall somewhere in the middle ground as opposed to doing like 6 sets per muscle group per session only once or twice a week? Can we do something that falls in the range of somewhere between like 10 to 20 or 12 to 24? That is my take on where do I fall, or how do I feel about that ultra high intensity, ultra low volume approach. I think, yes, let's keep the high intensity, but can we blend that with slightly more volume? Because I do think that most people, when I look around the gym, do not have the mentalities of the Mike Mentzers of the world, of the Dorian Yates of the world. They do not have the capacity to push themselves to the extent that those individuals were capable of. And so in order to kind of make up for that percentage difference in intensity that the average person is going to be able to exert in a session, can we do more sets and more exercises while still trying to work to the highest capacity possible? So that's my approach on it. I do think we need a bit of both. I think extremes in any case are not the ideal scenario for most people. For some people they work, but for the vast majority of people, I still do think you're going to need to do a decent, appreciable amount of volume for a muscle group across the course of the week. My preferred range is somewhere towards that 12 to 24. So somewhere on the moderate to slightly higher end of the spectrum when it comes to the amount of volume that you might do. So by volume, I mean sets and exercise for a muscle group in a session. Nonetheless, the unavoidable part of that equation being working to a high intensity, working as close to, if not to failure, if not in some cases past failure by virtue of partial repetitions. That is essentially my take on it. So you can take it, you can leave it, but I like to think, having built the natural physique that I have over 10 years, you can disregard or discredit my work through genetics, but I like to think that I do know what I'm talking about, to some degree. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'll see you in the next one.
For optimal results, the single most important factor is intensity of effort.